Newland, thank you for coming as well. Next guest I'd like to welcome to the microphone is a seafarer who's had the honour of representing workers not just here in Australia but around the world in his capacity both as MUA National Secretary and International Transport Workers Federation President, someone who needs no introduction, Paddy Crumlin.
Thanks, Paul, for that generous introduction. So that's very, what would you call that? It just brings out museum. I don't know what it means, but it's important to us. And it's just not about museum, it's about what we're doing now. See, firstly I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Where's Kev? Still here, Kev? And the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. When you hear about Cockle Bay, you can imagine it pre-1788 or right up to 1820. It was Cockle Bay because of the oysters and the wonderful seafood. And when you think of that our beautiful Indigenous race that walked all the way from Darwin, that's a long walk. But they didn't take a shortcut. They ended up over in Tassie. I'm not sure how they got across the Bass Strait, but that's probably another story. But see, part of the recognition if you can't recognise your Indigenous people, their spirituality and their diversity, the great length of time of isolation, their ability to nurture and function over 60,000 years, it's almost impossible to build a modern society predicated upon the same values of recognition, of mutual respect, of, ownership of everybody, of transparency. And I think our failure, and that's one of the reasons we recognise the traditional owner of the land and the elders, past, present and emerging, because it's about leadership too. It's about a recognition of continuity, that if you stick to the guns, you get there. And by recognising our Indigenous people, we're also recognising some of the finer values of the human condition. And I would dare to extend that to the Australian condition and the Australian community. And part of the failures in the community now is that we don't recognise that. We can't find that voice of reconciliation. We're still a diverse and elitist group where there's more to divide us than brings us together. And it's a terrible thing for our Indigenous people to see that, having nurtured the land, having developed their special spirituality that we know more and more about, the great diversity of language, to see over the last 200 or 300 years how we've taken something and haven't delivered something better in the way of human values and how you do it. And there's nothing more demonstrative than that, than in the area of, seafaring and the whole issue around merchant shipping. It's part of the wealth creation. It was essential in colonial times. It was essential in the First World War. We had a national line, the Commonwealth Steamship Line, that was dismantled. But by bipartisan belief, it was built up again because of the Second World War and the 1 in 8 seafarers that Paul referred to and that are mentioned on the anchors donated by the MUA and funded by BHP at that time. A little bit more on BHP in a second. And we've then been able to really produce something out of nothing out of something. When 1 in 8 Australian seafarers die, it's not a rhetorical thing or a sentimental thing any more than Anzac Day is a sentimental thing. It's a reminder about something given without wanting to take anything back. And when they found the Iron Crown, it's a tragic and sad reminder that that's a war grave where those seafarers were never recovered. And to find the shell of that ship, off the Victorian coast is a poignant reminder of what seafarers, from the captain to the deck boy, had given for their country. Was not to have the recognition, or not to put it in the context that what they were fighting for was an Australia that was inclusive and an Australia that would able to distribute opportunity, an aspirational Australia, an Australia that was prepared to fight and live for and die for. And, Paul mentioned the memorial up at Smoky Cape the other day, where the union wants to donate some in the memory of those seafarers lost. Just as the Iron... That was a ship that was lost in peace. Just a little ship, 1,300 deadweight, 24, 25 on the ship. Only 4 survived. The rest, the bodies were never found. And so when we were up there, it was the family and the community that were celebrating and reflecting on the meaning of the loss of those lives. It's something where Della Elliott and the other unions, Mick Fleming was involved in it, all 3 unions, AMP, because all 3 unions, well, there's 7 unions in those days, were all part of the nurturing of those families, widows and children, into another stage of their life. But to move on 50 years later and not have the footprint of what that meant, just a crew of Australian seafarers, all men that lost their life on an A&L ship, Australian National Line, owned by the government, under bipartisan, 50 years ago, it wasn't a Labor government, it was a Liberal government, it was a Conservative government that understood the importance of securing your coastal waters and the importance of protecting ourselves against international monopoly shipping interests that didn't have the Australian interests at heart. And when we think about those 2 ships and the lives lost, one lost at war, one lost in peace, it wasn't an historical fact, it's an existential fact. It's what the same qualities that we're looking for in our society today. An ability to redistribute wealth on a fair and identifiable basis. The ability for politicians to come together in a genuinely bipartisan way that provide jobs, provide industry, can agree the overall interests of the national interests and the sovereign interests, can differentiate on ways forward, but don't differentiate on what we stand for as a nation. And when we come here every year, as seafarers, and I see many chief engineers and engineers, officers, ratings, waterside workers, many who gave their life, and don't forget about Darwin and the bombing of Darwin. And Steve looks like a seaman, actually. Is he taken off? I look like the bloke looking after things, and you look like the union official, mate. Unbelievable. But and give my best to Kevin too. While I'm on it, I mean, this was going to be a monument to colonialism and the Royal Navy. If it wasn't for us, and it wasn't for you, but it wasn't for all of you, and it wasn't for our merchant history, if it wasn't for Alan Oliver, and it wasn't for the 3 unions, and if it wasn't for BHP, that were essential to Australian industry over that 100 years, that it probably would have been that. And when you mention the Waterside Workers mural, some of it which is on display, and some of it, Jimmy Donovan's here, the president of the union, will always be the president of the union, even though in retirement. Got no idea how much blood, sweat and tears, where's Jim, that went into getting that over in one piece, Jim, because this was the home. You decided at the Sydney branch, the mighty Sydney branch, the Waterside Workers Federation, now the MUA, wanted to make sure that footprint of labour, that footprint of history, was going to be recognised in our history here in the museum, so that it would also be a segue for what we had achieved as what we can achieve. So while we come here in a process of celebration, we come here in a process of recognition and memorial, we also come here that our message will reach out into a society that seems to be rudderless of real political leadership, into a society that has never relied on shipping more than it does today, into a society and into an economic community where our industry is failing and we're relying more and more on international trade to secure the wealth, to secure the community and social benefits. We come here proud seafarers, proud maritime workers, proud waterside workers, that we didn't just fight for our members. We didn't just look for a redistribution and a decent redistribution of the quality and importance and value of our labour. We came here and gave our lives in war and peace to build a better Australia, a survivable Australia, a society like all of those young students that want a future, not just a future where, you know, we have an environment to survive, but a future where decent jobs based on an ability to identify the importance of our economy and our national interest isn't set aside by political cynicism and elitism. That's our hope. And there's no better place than a museum. A museum is a mirror on the past. For yesterday's history, Steve, tomorrow's a mystery, and today's the gift that we've got in celebration of those lives given, those lives saved, all of those families from the Noongar that were secured by not secured by the company. A&L's gone now. Australian National Line is an FOC with Panamanian flag and has no contact whatsoever. And it was privatised in this country and is still servicing international interests. And it was set up by Black Jack McEwen in a bipartisan way so that we would secure against colonial manipulation or monopoly, or against international ship own and economic monopoly, we would secure our sovereign rights. Now, it's extraordinarily important on that basis and for those families and for those lost lives that when we reflect on what's been given, we also reflect on our determination, our courage in the face of political adversity, our willingness to know that in real truth lies power, not just for a few, but for all Australians and by extension, all seafarers. Thanks very much. And again, on reflection, maybe we can all stand up just for a minute and reflect the wonderful contribution that these anchors represent. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen, friends and comrades.